promise was made the prophets of old. From David's throne a Savior foretold. The Word became flesh, God's only Son. Light of the world, the righteous one.
So just to recap, we're going to be studying the doctrine of God. And this is probably going to take us about a year or so to get through. But this first little portion that we're looking at is looking at, does God exist? Right? Okay, before we even get into what God is like, what his attributes are, all of that kind of thing, his omniscience, the Trinity. That's going to be a fun one. What does it mean that he's all-powerful? Before we get into all of that, we're going to just look at, does God exist? Now, of course, we say yes, right? We know him, we know the Lord, we know Jesus, hearts changed inside out. But there's a whole portion of folks out there in the world who think that this is actually a serious question. A question that needs to be, that they wonder, does he even exist? How do you know he exists? Where is he at? How can you tell? And so we're going to address that because that's the culture we live in. We're surrounded by a culture that says God doesn't exist. And so we're going to take the time to look at that. Of course, I always want to give some credit. Our study from True You, I'm straight ripping it off. There's a DVD series that's taught by Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, great guy. But I figured y'all don't want to come to church and watch TV, so I'm going to teach through it. But it is a good bit there. Last week, we just kind of set the stage a little bit. We talked about 4 different worldviews, kind of ways of thinking and viewing the world and thinking about things that we're going to compare, one of which being God. But the big one in our culture nowadays is what's called materialism, naturalism. And we have our little illustrations there where the big circle represents the universe. It represents the cosmos, everything that exists. Like you got the pendulum as the laws of nature, and your trees and your stars and your planets and your people and your animals. Everything in the universe is the big circle. Materialism says that's it. There's nothing outside of the circle. Matter, the universe is all that exists. And then we have deism that says yes, there is a God. But all he did was just create the world and just let it go. He doesn't care, he's not interested, he's not involved, he just wound it up and let it go. Then you have theism, which would be Christianity would fall in this category, that says, yes, there's a God he created, but he also sustains and upholds the world. Colossians chapter 1 tells us that. And then there's also that he gets involved in his creation, miracles and the such, talking to people, answering prayers, that sort of thing. Then you have this other one, not so big a deal in our culture, maybe Eastern cultures it's bought into, pantheism. It's this idea that God is everything and in everything and everything is part of God, that God is the universe, that God is not a being with a mind and an intellect, more like the Force in Star Wars, that it's just some mystical force that is just in everything and part of everything. And so those are the 4 major views. And we talked about that what we're going to do is we're going to look at evidence, experience, different things from nature and science, and say, okay, which of these worldviews best explains this piece of evidence that we have before us? And so that is how we're going to be approaching this. And of course, since we're all Christians here, whenever it comes to the question of what is the thing from which everything else comes, right? Because that was the big question we were looking at. Does God exist? That's the other way of asking that. We say, well, the Bible's pretty clear. In the beginning, God. That's the beginning. It began with God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He is the thing from which everything else comes. And actually, in the Bible, it also tells us that we can see that in nature. Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day pours forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. That as you look around nature, look at the sky and you can know there's God. Right? We're out in the country. You get away from some lights, you can see some amazing stuff up there, right? When I was a teenager in California, we would go on camping, rock climbing trips out into Joshua Tree National Park. You get out there in the desert, and that sky is big and bright. There is nothing blocking that view, and it's just amazing. You can see the handiwork of the Lord. Paul in Romans chapter 1 echoes this idea, where he says that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. Okay, the physical world reveals the reality and attributes of the Creator. There is a Creator, and you look around and you can see his fingerprints on creation. Now, we all know this is how it works. Any artists, right? You are craftsmen. I know you craft. That you make things. If you're painting or whatever it is that you make, kind of your personality kind of comes out in what you make, right? The art reflects the artist. The creation reflects the Creator. This is why, if my 6-year-old daughter starts drawing skulls and, dead people, we worry, right? Because it's what is inside is coming out. And so the same thing, as we look at creation, it reflects the Creator. And so we can know about the Creator from what has been made. However, not everyone believes that. These guys, they're a little outdated. They're still out there making some waves and attention. They're called, or they called themselves, or they were kind of labeled as the new atheists. There's really nothing new about their arguments. Same old arguments atheists have been arguing for centuries, but they're repackaged and given a new face and a new kind of PR campaign. Some of them are scientists, some of them are activists. You got Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, these other two guys that just get out there and they would argue, and they wrote these books, and it's just really popular, real personable type stuff, and it really caught on. Especially in a secular culture that's kind of trying to exist without God anyway, so people grabbed onto these kind of things. Christopher Hitchens, he wrote that book there, God is Not Great. And he actually calls himself an anti-theist, or I should say called. He died a few years ago of cancer. But he was very, very militantly anti-religion. Shortly after 2001, these guys jumped on the bandwagon about how they would point at the Twin Towers coming down and say, this is what religion does. This is where your faith gets you. You should believe in reason and science. And that's what they taught. That's what they believed. And they did a really good job of it. Some of these guys are very personable. I was pointing out Christopher Hitchens because he's a fun guy. I've watched several of his debates that he's had. You can look them up on YouTube. And his arguments are terrible, but he's very likable. I mean, rhetorical, his speaking, you just want to like the guy and go, oh, well, that actually sounds kind of interesting. So you can see how it would gain popularity. But one of the things these guys would say is that God is an illusion. God doesn't exist. He's an illusion. Imaginary. Figment of your imagination. It's your imaginary friend. If you're a little kid, it's cute. Whenever you grow up, you need to put it aside. That is what they would say. That there is no evidence. They would say there's no evidence, no reason why you should believe in God. It's all just a figment of your imagination. Let me see if I can make this work. Maybe, maybe not. Okay, that is not. If I can figure out how to work the computer. How do I make my slideshow go away? Okay. Nope. Well. I can't find. Okay, well, let me do. I can't even find my resume. Alright, well, I broke it. I had a video that I wanted to show, but it is not that big of a deal. My Windows key. No. Oh, well, I'll just continue from where we're at. Basically, the video is Richard Dawkins. He was one of those guys here that we were seeing who is he's actually a biologist. This is, I broke it. All right. Hey, there we go. Well, here. This is Richard Dawkins. He's actually a biologist at, I believe, Oxford, and that is not working. Volume on that's probably turned down, isn't it? Okay. All right. Apologize for not being more prepared. Basically, what he says there is that because of Darwin, and Darwin explaining the origin of the species and how everything evolved, that we don't have to believe in God. That it was shown that, yes, we may look around and think that the world looks designed, but it actually is not. And that because of scientists like Darwin, we now know the natural processes that brought about these things, and we no longer have to consider God. That it might seem reasonable to us that we would think there's a God, but now we know better than that. And so that is what he is saying. That's what he is putting forth. And so here's the deal. We say we have the Bible and it says there's God, and they say, well, we have science and it says there is no God. So how do we know which one of us is right? I hit the wrong button. Doo-doo-doo. All this newfangled technology. Now here's the deal. If they want to sit there and claim that science says there is no God, they're going to run into a really big problem with the people who founded modern science. Guys like this guy here, John Ray, who is the founder of modern biology. Pretty much everything that exists of biology and science, they owe their beginnings to this guy. And he wrote this book, actually a two-parter, called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. Does that sound like, a scientist saying there is no God? No, that's a scientist looking at creation and saying that he sees God. Isaac Newton, right? We've heard of him. He's the guy, the apple hit him on the head and he came up with the idea of gravity. Right? He says, talking about the planets and the sun and the comets and the moons and everything in motion, he says, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And he's still, even today, centuries later, considered probably to be one of the most intelligent scientists to ever live. But you go on and you have Galileo. It's a common fictional story that people have that Galileo was persecuted by the church because he believed the earth went around the sun. Actually, no, that's not the case. Galileo was arrested and put under house arrest from the church because he was a jerk. It was for political reasons because he insulted and offended the Pope. The Pope actually had invited him to come present his theory because he thought it sounded pretty neat. He wanted to hear more about it. And so, but he was a bit of a jerk and an arrogant guy, and he had just offended the wrong people and got in trouble. That's really why Galileo got in trouble. It had nothing to do with science. People actually liked his science. Kepler, who founded the laws of planetary motion. Newton, we were talking about Ray. Boyle, he's the guy who figured out the laws of compression for gas. That pressure increases as volume decreases. So like all the air in this room, if you were to punch a hole in the wall, all you basically did was punch a hole in the wall. We now know, common sense, that if you take all this air in this room and you compress it down into one container, and you punch a hole in that container, what's going to happen? Boom! Right? Because it's under such strong pressure. Boyle's the guy that figured all that out. And these people, these scientists who paved the way for modern science, they looked around at creation and they said, this is the handiwork of God. Even though they were discovering things in their own fields, they thought that they were discovering design in nature. They looked at nature and they saw the handiwork of God in front of them. Critics will say, oh, well, okay, they were Christian because everybody was Christian back then. You're born into a family, in church, you're Christian. But, they were really scientists, had nothing to do with God. If you read their writings, it is all through their writings that they're pointing to God and giving glory and credit to God for science. Because they believed in God, who is an intelligent, rational being who created the world, and we're made in His image, which we have an intelligence and rational beings ourselves, so that we can study what He has made. And they said, hey, God is intelligent, we're intelligent, He made the world, we can figure out how it works. And so that is what they were going on, was that to begin with. And so, however, so the founders were not only advancing their fields, they were made design arguments. However, the Darwin lobby, the people who want to say this is what the science says and you cannot say anything else, the Darwin lobby is very strong. You will not find textbooks in schools that are critical of current popular scientific theory. They will not teach you the weaknesses, they will not teach you the criticism, they will not teach you the alternate theories, but they're out there in the scientific literature, in the science journals, between scientists themselves. They know these problems exist, but you're not going to see them in the textbooks. They don't want you to think any of this. And so, okay, so how did we get there? How did we get from Galileo and Newton and Boyle to Richard Dawkins? How did we get from the handiwork of God to science shows that there is no such thing as God? How did we get from there, point A to point B? Well, in about 1800s, early 1800s, okay, Newton, you're going to get a little science history lesson here. Newton, Boyle, all them, those were a little earlier, 1700s. Around 1800, 1802, there's this French astronomer called Pierre Laplace. And he had this theory about how the planets formed from gravity. And Napoleon thought, hey, well, this is pretty neat. I want to hear more. And he brought Laplace there, and he gave him a commendation for his science. And he said, but I noticed something. Supposedly, here's how the story goes. I noticed that you don't mention God. Right? Newton talked about God all the time. Why don't you mention God? And Laplace allegedly responds, sir, I have no need of that hypothesis. I have no need of God. I don't need God. I have these natural processes from which I can explain to you. God is out of the picture. And then you see progressively through the 1800s that same kind of thing happening over and over. Geology, where they're figuring out rocks and erosion and the way water and rivers flow and carve out canyons and that kind of stuff. And then they're saying, oh, well, see, we know how this happens. We don't need God. Their picture of God was that He exists in the unknown. Well, we don't know what did that. Oh, it must be God. Well, so now we know it. We don't need God. That's what's called God of the gaps. God just exists in our gaps of knowledge. And whenever we find out something new, okay, we don't need God for that. And they're saying, well, we no longer need God. Well, that's not who God is. That's not what God is. It's not just a God of the gaps. He's God over all of creation. And so, as it's going along, in the 1800s, they're just finding out more and more and more about how the way things work. And then Darwin comes along and he even says, well, hey, now we know, I have a theory to tell us how life came about. And how all these different species and all these different animals, even humans, how it all came around. And we don't need God to explain any of it. And so, starting around 1800, by the time you get to 1900, science is pretty much dominated by people who say, yeah, we don't need God. We figured it all out. Or are figuring it out, and we don't need God. Here is Douglas Foote. I'm not even going to try it. He's a biologist. He says, by coupling the undirected, purposeless variations to blind, uncaring processes of natural selection, Darwin made the theological or spiritual explanations of the life process superfluous. Why do they have to use such big words? All he basically said is, hey, you know what? We figured out these natural processes we think did it, so we don't need spiritual or supernatural things. We just throw it out the window. And you kind of figure, okay, well, how can they figure this? How does this work? What is the one thing, though, that they have not answered? What's the question they haven't answered? What's the question we are asking? What is the thing from which everything comes? So they're giving you theories about how it may have happened, but where did it come from? Right? They're not even answering that question. The reason is, back then, they all thought that the universe was infinite. Eternal, went on forever and ever and ever in the past. The universe just goes and goes and goes. Got my slides out of order, but that's okay. We say God came first, and He created everything. Right? In the theistic worldview, God comes first, matter second. In materialism, it is matter first, and matter has always existed. May have been in different forms, but it's always been here, so we don't need to explain it. They thought the universe had always existed. So they have this little chain you can kind of work your way back. What caused human life to arise? Well, we evolved from lower animals, they say. Well, where did those lower animals come from? Well, still lower animals. Where did those come from? The amoeba or single-celled organisms. Where did those come from? Well, they came from the chemicals in the primordial soup. Where did those chemicals come from? Well, the elementary particles and molecules. Well, where did those come from? Oh, well, those have been there all along. They've always existed. Right? For the materialism, material has just always been there from eternity. It's always been eternal, self-existent. The material universe has always been there. You all know Carl Sagan had the series Cosmos. What was that, back in the 80s, 70s, 80s? Neil deGrasse Tyson redid it here, a couple years ago. Carl Sagan famously is known for saying that the cosmos, the universe, is all that is or was or ever will be. The universe is eternal. It's always existed. That's what they believe. But they're going to run into a little bit of a problem, because there's some scientific evidence that is going to say otherwise. You ever heard of a guy named Edwin Hubble? Have you heard of the Hubble Space Telescope? Right, up there, it's named after this guy, Edwin Hubble. He was an astronomer back in the early 1900s who, right about that time, they were coming up with these big dome telescopes. You know, see these observatories, where it's like the thing pulls open and the big, telescope comes out and they can actually focus up at the sky. Well, he was working at one of those, and he noticed that there's these spots of light out there. Those aren't stars. They're galaxies. And he was seeing pictures of galaxies. So there's not just our galaxy, there's all these other galaxies out there. Well, he got this picture, and this is called the Hubble Deep Field. Okay, you see all that? I don't know how well you can see that, but those are galaxies. All those little spots are galaxies. That arrow is pointing to that itty-bitty spot right in the middle. Well, he zoomed into that itty-bitty spot right in the middle, and he found more galaxies. That right there is the zoom in of that itty-bitty spot. More and more galaxies. Billions and billions of galaxies with billions and billions of stars. And he found out something very interesting. He noticed something about the light waves of these stars. They all appeared kind of red. Now that's interesting, because if you know the Doppler, if you get a little science lesson, the Doppler Effect. Right? You may not know that word, but have you ever been to a NASCAR race? Or any other kind of car race? Right? You ever stood near a road as traffic goes by? And you hear it gets higher pitched, higher pitched, higher pitched, higher pitched, and then boom, it goes by and it gets lower pitched. Right? You hear them coming, it's right? That's the Doppler effect. What happens is, as the car is approaching you, the sound waves are compressed, because that sound is coming at you. So the sound waves are compressed. Higher frequency sound. Whenever it's going away from you, the sound waves are stretched. Lower frequency. And so you get the lower sound. Well, that's sound. Well, light is also waves, just like sound. But in light, the stretched out waves, whenever something is going away from you, the stretched out waves are towards the red end of the spectrum. Well, so what's happening is Hubble is looking up in this telescope, and all around him, everywhere he points it, anywhere in the sky, he's seeing that the galaxies, the further out they are, the more red they get. That means they're moving away from us, faster and faster as it goes. So the universe then isn't just sitting there. It's expanding. All the galaxies are in motion. And everywhere he looks, it's spreading out. And so, this evidence is showing that the universe is expanding. Now, scientists didn't like this because if the universe is expanding, you run that clock backwards, what happens? You get back to a beginning point. Uh-oh. If there's a beginning point to the universe, what began it? Now they have a problem. They don't want to accept that. There's another scientist, really bad hair, poofy mustache. You may have heard of him, Einstein, right? Really smart guy. Well, he had his own theory working with gravity. And what he figured out in his equations was that in order for gravity, the force of gravity, there had to be this other force acting on things or else it would all just collapse in upon itself. And so his equations worked out to where there actually had to be this expansion going on. The force acting against the gravity would actually be an expansion. He said, well, that can't be right. Because as far as he knew, the universe had always existed. There was no expansion. So he kind of fudged the numbers a little bit so that it would, equal out with no expansion. Then he heard of Hubble's discovery, and they got together. He actually went out there and looked in Hubble's telescope. News covered it. It was a big deal. Here's two of the top scientists in the world coming together. And Einstein had to admit, he said, I now see the necessity of a beginning. The universe is expanding. All the evidence points to a universe expanding. Einstein, one of the most brilliant scientists to ever walk the planet, says, yeah, you know what, I see that there had to be a beginning. Now, not everybody was as happy with this kind of stuff. You have here Sir Arthur Eddington. He was an astronomer. He said, philosophically, not science, not because of the evidence, philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order is repugnant to me. I should like to find a genuine loophole. I simply do not believe that the present order of things started off with a bang. The expanding universe is preposterous. It leaves me cold. He didn't want to believe it. He just said, no, I don't want to accept it. Another guy, Robert Dickey, he says, an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of understanding the origin at any finite time in the past. So he's saying, if the universe was infinite, we wouldn't have to bother with the beginning. But that's not where the evidence is pointing. With a universe expanding, you go backwards in time, you get to a single point. And you have all these guys who don't want to accept that. There is something about a finite universe that is troubling to these atheists, to these scientists. They don't want to accept it. Why not? Why would they not want to accept that there's a beginning? Because if you have a beginning, what do you need? A beginner, right? This is actually a very ancient argument. There's a few different formations of it, but it basically goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. If the universe began to exist, it therefore must have a cause that is transcendent, that is beyond itself. Right? You get that the universe can't cause itself, right? Because it doesn't exist to cause itself to exist. So in order for the universe to come about, there has to be something that is outside of the universe to cause the universe. And this is what the evidence from science is pointing to. A couple more quotes. Alan Sandage. He was an agnostic astronomer. He was not really looking for God, wasn't interested, but he came out and actually stated, here is evidence for what can only be described as a supernatural event. So he wasn't a Christian, he wasn't a theist, he wasn't a God believer, but he's looking at the evidence and he says, guys, the only thing that explains this is a supernatural event. Something outside of nature had to cause the universe. This right here is one of my favorite quotes. Robert Jastrow, who's also an astronomer, talking about this evidence and this realization. The scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been there for centuries. Right, so science has been, throughout the 1800s, we're looking at and saying, we don't need God, there is no God, and we're finally going to figure it all out, and okay, they're finding evidence that points to a God. Hey, look, the Bible had it right all along. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, so we're comparing, right? So we have this evidence, we have the redshift, we have the Doppler effect. It's expanding. The universe is expanding. Can't escape it. Can't get away from it. So what worldview kind of better explains this evidence? Well, we have materialism. If we need a cause outside the universe, does materialism give us something that's outside the universe? No. There's nothing outside the universe on materialism. How about pantheism? Is there a cause outside the universe? No. On pantheism, even God is inside the universe. So that's not it. Well, we have theism. Looky there. There's God hanging outside the universe. There's a worldview that makes sense, right? That God created. Now, at this point, we haven't gotten to proving Yahweh, right? We're not at showing Genesis to be true. We're just saying, hey, belief in God makes more sense on the evidence. Because even deism makes sense with this evidence. All we know at this point is that God created. Now, he could not be active, right? That worldview would make sense of this evidence. But we'll get into that some more. Next week we'll get into some more about the beginning, but then some more about some fine-tuning and some stuff about the universe that just kind of shows, hey, guys, this other stuff doesn't add up. It's the Bible that is making sense, that God does actually exist. So, any questions? I know you got a little history lesson, a little science lesson. But the scientific evidence is showing, there was a definite, singular, finite point beginning of the universe. And if it has a beginning, there has to be a beginner. But I know we ran through that kind of fast because we were a little compressed because of business meeting. But questions? Anything? Criticisms? Insults? Throw something at me? I don't know. No? Okay. Well, we are just about out of time then. So let's pray.
While we were sinners, Christ died for us. The blood of Jesus saves. You make us right in your sight. You turn our dark into light. You open wide the door to your throne. You make us holy and pure. All of our hope is secure in Christ alone.